Hello, this is Brian Tonsoni with Sports Talk with Tonsoni, and we're having the pleasure of interviewing some of the best journalists from across the country to help Sports Talk with Tonsoni and the writers for Sports Talk with Tonsoni in a new webpage venture. Today, my guest is Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star, and he's agreed to take a few of our questions to help our students, and we're very thankful for that. Zach, thanks for being on the show. And I guess if we could just get started, if you could talk to a class of freshmen through seniors who are interested in sports, podcasting, and writing, what are some of the key things you think they need to pay attention to?
I think the first thing is I think about, I think back to when I was younger in this job, and this is probably still something I struggle with, today. And I've been doing this professionally for almost a decade now, is when you go into writing something, it's obviously, anybody will tell you anytime you write anything, whether it be a newspaper article or a research paper for a class, you want to have a strong sort of thesis statement. In journalism, we tend to call it kind of like a nut graph. But something I think I struggled with a lot when I was younger, and again, probably still something I struggle with from time to time, is making sure that I hold on to that strong sort of statement of what is this about throughout the whole story. And when I'm writing and I'm going through and I'm picking out quotes or I'm picking out stats or I'm trying to structure sort of maybe an argument within the story, is it all kind of consistent with what I set out to basically tell people from the very beginning? And I think that's even harder now. You mentioned podcasting. I do a fair bit of podcasting. I think it's even harder in podcasting because it's really easy to sit there and talk and make one point, then another point, and then all of a sudden you're kind of lost in your words and, maybe lost again if you want to introduce statistics or something like that, or quotes, you get lost in those a little bit. And so you just kind of wind up meandering, and I think you can tend to lose readers or listeners if you do that. And again, it's something I probably still struggle with now. You can probably hear me right now rambling a little bit, but that's something I've always really strived to do, is whatever I'm writing about, be it, obviously a lot of times IU basketball, IU football, but maybe it's a Pacers story. Maybe it's, helping out covering local colleges in Indianapolis. Maybe it's something totally unrelated to everything else I ever write. It's just making sure that every part of that story is holding tightly to the basic idea that I wanted to get across when I sat down and decided this is what I need to write today. This is what, this is the best or the most important or the most newsworthy thing that I've got to write about or talk about on a podcast, today.
That's very interesting, and something that I think all writers struggle with. As I've started writing a couple articles for a website, it's really, you have a story, and what is your main point, and stick to it, and bring in evidence and supporting documentation for that, but stay with that story. What would you say to people in using information, using sources? How do you report on sports? How do you find good information to add to your story?
Well, I certainly, I think there's a few ways. I mean, first of all, obviously some of those sources are going to be natural, Archie Miller or, Tom Allen or Fred Glass. I use AD. Those are obvious sources for me at different points throughout the year. If it's the middle of basketball season, I'm going to be asking questions of Archie Miller a lot. You also find sources in just kind of the natural day-to-day in terms of sort of personal sources, person-to-person sourcing. You find that in the natural day-to-day of your job. You meet maybe somebody around a football program. You cover a recruit who winds up playing for 4 years at IU, and you get to know their parents, when you're writing about them as a high school player. All sorts of those just different personal interactions that I think, as long as you kind of prove to people that you are trustworthy and that you're honest and that you're fair, and that even if, sometimes they may not agree with what you write, sometimes they may not like what you write, but if they can trust that it's coming from a genuine place of objectivity and honesty, then, you build up just kind of that credibility, I guess, and more people are willing to trust you with sensitive information. When it comes to maybe the harder, sort of data-driven sources and things, I think you just pick those up over time. I wouldn't have known what, for example, collegefootballstats.com was 5 years ago. Now I'm on CFBstats.com literally every day during college football season. KenPom.com for people who are really into the advanced stats for basketball is obviously a massive resource. And it's just one of those things that you find organically in your job. And when you find sources like that, it's the easiest thing in the world to just drag a bookmark down or, just kind of jot it down somewhere and say, let me circle back to this. There's always good numbers here, good information to sort through. And so you wind up in this situation where you can have kind of I guess you'd say the empirical sources on one hand, things you can't argue with, like numbers and stats and averages, and then sort of, again, your personal sources on the other. And it's always just on a story by story basis, I guess, really a challenge of merging those two. Some stories are going to need more numbers and more facts to back up. Some stories you're going to be looking more for people's opinions. You're going to be looking for expert opinions, people to talk to you about, people who are, let's say there's a big college basketball rule change. Well, that's not really a story that's going to be as numbers driven as it maybe is going to be driven by getting the thoughts of college basketball coaches and players and parents and people who are going to have to live through that rule change and what it means. And so then you're constantly just sort of balancing, what among those sources you need from story to story.
You bring up two questions in listening to you answer that question. My wife's an English teacher. I teach history, but believe in writing quite a bit. The accuracy of your sourcing, when you get information and quotes from your sources, could you explain to our students how important it is to be as accurate as possible? I would think to gain trust, but how important is accuracy? We deal with plagiarism at the high school level quite a bit. Acknowledging sources, how does that play out in the sports department?
Yeah, I mean, without that trust, you don't really have anything, and that comes into doing my job when it comes to, again, maybe getting a potential source to trust me. If I'm going to come and ask them a question about a sensitive topic, I don't know what, I'm just kind of making this up. Let's say a coach gets fired and I'm trying to figure out what's happening. Has it happened? What does anybody know? I'll go back to these sources. They've got to know that they can trust that I'm going to keep anything they say that's off the record or confidential or whatever, that is going to stay between us, that I'm not going to burn them. Readers at the same time also have to trust that I'm acting in their interests, that I'm giving them something that's unobjective or at least unbiased, and I do think that can be tricky sometimes because in the modern media world now, you see reporters ask, I'm not really asked to give my opinions on things, but I am certainly asked to analyze, not to just sort of present facts and quotes and sort of events as they happen and let people draw their own conclusions. I'm asked to analyze sometimes and say, this is what I thought was maybe the most important part of Tuesday night's win against Northwestern. And so it gets a little bit tricky because you want people to respect it, or want people to know that you still respect sort of a level of, again, a lack of bias in doing your job, but you're also maybe being a little bit more personal in your coverage than probably someone in my job would have been 10 or 20 years ago, if that makes sense.
Yeah, is that different for podcasting? Writing and for the Indy Star and having something in print and online, is that different than when you're a podcast guest and you're what I would think maybe more personal opinion analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think so to a degree because, if like, let's say a radio station calls me up because, IU's playing at Ohio State on a Saturday and there's a radio station in Columbus that wants sort of the IU view. If they're calling me because, they sort of view me, I don't want to say as an expert, that feels very sort of self-serving, but they view me as someone who is really well-versed in what's going on with IU football, more well-versed than they're going to be. So they're going to be asking things that are a little bit more my opinion. They're going to be asking, again, for me to be really analytical in the way that I'm talking about whatever the subject is. So, again, this sounds a little bit like sort of apples and apples. I get it. But I think there can be a difference to say, here is analysis of what's gone wrong with, IU's run game, for example, or what's gone right for IU's defense, for example, this season, and me just saying, well, I think the defensive coordinator should be fired. That's not something I would ever say on a podcast, a radio show. That's not something I'd probably ever write. But it is something, if you can come at it from maybe it's not as different as I sort of said it was at the outset. If I can come at it from a stats perspective, from sort of a perspective that is backed up by facts and backed up by hard and fast things that I can point to as evidence, then whether I'm writing it or whether I'm saying it on the in-house podcast we do, or I'm saying it on a podcast or a radio show someone else has invited me onto, I still feel like I've sort of done my due diligence there, because I'm not saying anything that I can't back up with, facts and empirical evidence, if that makes sense. Again, I know this is all a little bit, it's sort of like, it kind of stops at the water's edge, basically, what I do of inserting my own opinion into my coverage.
How difficult is it and important to ask good questions in press conferences or in interviews? It can be when you get a source.
No, I mean, it can be really difficult because the press conference is it's not a chaotic situation, but you have a lot of people in the room at once. Everybody's kind of got their own story that they're working on a lot of the time. And everybody wants to make sure that if they have a topic that needs addressed or something like that, that they get it addressed. You don't always get a coach you get a coach 10 minutes after a tough loss. You might not be in the most talkative mood. You get, for example, like when we're on the road with IU basketball, a lot of the time they need to have that post-game sort of chat moved fairly quickly because they've got to catch a bus to catch a plane to get back to Bloomington. And we're all going to turn around and write our stories. There's times where IU basketball, for example, is back, in Bloomington before I leave the arena that they played in the night before. So it can be tough. And I think it really is important to ask good questions, it's very important in a press conference to ask good questions, to not just say, can you talk about X? Because that just leaves it so open-ended. It lets a coach take it in whatever direction they want. And then you probably won't get what you're looking for. It's also important to do it in a one-on-one situation, because that's when you can really get, if you can ask thought-provoking questions and really engage with your subject, whether it's one-on-one or a press conference, you get them thinking, then they're going to give you better answers. Those answers might prompt you to have even more questions. The number of interviews you'll do where you go in with saying, all right, I want to make sure I get sort of these questions answered. I don't have them written out, but I have sort of in my mind a list of questions that at some level I need an answer to in that interview. But then in the process of getting those questions answered, more questions arise. And so the interview just kind of naturally evolves from there. You just have to make sure that you're asking the right kinds of questions that are going to get to the heart of whatever you're trying to talk to somebody about, whether it is in a press conference setting, which can be a little bit frustrating, or it's in something a little bit more one-on-one, or at least a little bit more personal, like a locker room setting or something like that, where maybe it's you, one other reporter, and a player just kind of sitting in front of their locker relaxing after a game.
I wish I had talked to you a little bit earlier in the spring. I had a chance to interview Bart Kaufman, do a podcast with Bart Kaufman about naming rights on the IU baseball stadium. And I had my questions all laid out. And the first question, he answered like 6 of the 8 questions. And so I was swimming for where do I go next and where do I tie this all back in on his support for Indiana baseball. So the questioning, I think, Zach, too, I'm going to play this for my students that aren't even in my econ students and U.S. history questions or U.S. history classes, because I believe questioning is so vital in the world. And it should lead to good answers and to other. I loved that answer. I got a couple more questions, and I know you're a busy man, and I'll let you go. Choosing your stories. Do you choose stories that you think your readership or viewership wants to hear, or do you have some stories that you would like to tell and you would like to write from your point of view, or is it maybe some kind of combination?
It's a combination. I mean, look, there's and it's, you can kind of go all one way. There's this perception that it's all one way or all the other, that it's all just what the journalist wants to write about, what journalists or reporters think are interesting or important at the total expense of what readers want to know about, or it's total just sort of clickbait. All it is just sort of the old sort of, I guess, sort of like the celebrity gossip, kind of stuff that it's just feeding only what readers want, basic surface stuff all the time. I think it's always a combination. I think any good reporter has to have enough command of his or her beat, or if maybe you're a columnist, it even has to be beats, plural, that you know what the storylines are at any given time. So that if, for example, and I use these IU examples because it's obviously what's freshest in my mind. People are going to want to read about Romeo Langford coming into this basketball season. That's not writing stories about Romeo Langford. As long as they're good stories, they're well reported and well thought out, and they explore topics that haven't just been covered ad nauseum before. Writing those stories is doing a good job, is handling my job well, because that's what people want to write about, and that's the story. A storyline like that, a player like that, a talent like that, that's the story. On the other hand, there's at times I think I've heard people in the business kind of talk about it like serving readers their vegetables. I write a story, for example, every season, every year, every athletic department in the NCAA has to submit a financial report, a detailed financial report to the NCAA of all their revenues and expenses. And there's, I think, 18 categories for revenues and 18 categories for expenses. And so you can take these things and you can compare schools and where they spend their money and where they make their money. You can also compare a school to what it was, let's say 5-6 years ago. Have revenues increased or decreased? Are they taking state funding where they weren't before? Are they spending a lot more on coaches' salaries or something like that? I write a story every single year that I get a hold of that report sometime in usually late January or February. I'm guessing not a ton of people read that story, but I write that story so those numbers are out there, so that when I reference those numbers in a dozen other stories throughout the year, people can go back to that as a place to start and say, oh, okay, this is what, this is the basis for all of this stuff. And so it's not always, you have to know, you certainly have to have a good grip on what your readers want and what they want to read and what's newsworthy and important to them. Because at the end of the day, there's no point in doing this if nobody's reading what I'm writing. But at the same time, people are also going to be looking at somebody in my job, for example, a beat writer who covers one university athletic department very specifically. People are going to be looking at me very often and saying, well, what should I care about? You're there every day. You're in these practices. You're in these press conferences. You're talking to these coaches and these players and these administrators. You tell me what's going on, what the most important thing I should be worrying about right now is. And so you also have to have a good command of maybe what needs to be written and what's important, whether people know it or not, whether the average fan knows it or not, what really should be out there, if that makes sense. It's always kind of a blend.
We're talking with Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star, and we're talking about suggestions and key things for young high school sports reporters, whether they're going into journalism as a career or just add to their skills for their future. We appreciate Zach. I got just two more questions. This has been a great conversation. But you started off and you said the command of a story, and make sure your thesis is followed in everything, every paragraph, and you stay tight to the main part of your story. What's one mistake you see young professionals make that our young writers or startup writers might be aware of as they get started that they would need to avoid?
Something I think, especially in thinking about command of the story, something I used to be very guilty of, and probably still am, really. In fact, I'm sure I still am, but I think I'm hopefully less guilty of it, or guilty of it less often than I used to be. Is, let's say you're writing let's say, for example, you're writing a big feature, or you're writing a game story after a really dramatic win, a win over a ranked team, a win in the postseason, whatever. Something I would struggle with is, and I think a lot of the reason why I'd lose command of the story is I would get these great quotes and I would find these great stats and I would see these great scenes, for like a profile story or a big game recap. And I would be like, well, I got to use that in my story. I got to use that, this picture I'm going to paint. It's great for my story, but it really isn't great for my story. It's just kind of flowery and nice to have in the story because it feels good to write it. This quote is a great quote from a coach that drops just some deadpan joke or whatever after a win, but does it really serve my story? And so what I'd have is stories that often would kind of lose their grip on what they were supposed to be about because they would just get too bloated with all of this stuff that I loved. Great quotes, great stats, great scenes that really didn't actually add anything to the story. And so I was just sort of shoving them in because I wanted people to see, oh, I got this great quote, or I saw this great scene that you really should sort of read about from this game. But it didn't advance my story in any way. And so then what would happen is I'd turn in a story that was 250, 300 words longer than it needed to be. And whether it's in the newspaper or certainly in a more sort of digital first online readership kind of world, you're going to lose readers that way. And your writing's going to become confusing because they're going to look through and say, well, what was the point of this quote? What did that really accomplish for the story? You were trying to tell me, you said at the top of this story that it was about this, but then you threw in these 3 or 4 things that really had nothing to do with what you told me the story was about. And you just kind of lost me. You just, me as the reader, I just sort of got lost in the story a little bit. And so I think that's one thing. Again, it's probably something I still struggle with every day, but I know it's something that when I was younger, I would struggle with just because I would get kind of obsessed with, that they always tell you when you to write a good story, you need all these great little nuggets, these information, the quotes, the information, the scene, sort of bits. Those are all what are going to make a story great, make it pop, make it exciting, keep people reading. But like I would just sort of get so obsessed with having those things in my story that I would put them in whether they actually advanced the story or not. And then I'd wind up with a story that was bloated and confusing and didn't really accomplish what I was trying to do to begin with anyway. So that's something I think, again, I still try to be mindful of to this day. And I think it's certainly something that I struggled with when I was, younger.
Last question for you, Zach. We really appreciate your time. Why do you enjoy writing sports? And you do it for a profession. Why should young kids, I have 8th graders interested all the way up to recent graduates who are in college but not writing for their college newspaper that are interested in writing for a startup webpage. Why is it something you enjoy?
I don't know if there's one answer to that. I kind of got into journalism because my dad was a reporter and I watched him do it. And, it was something that always fascinated me. I guess maybe the core thing is I just like telling good stories, and sometimes a good story is literally just one story. It's a story about, an IU athlete overcoming the death of a parent to have success, or a coach who, battled through all this life adversity to reach a level of success in his or her particular sport. Sometimes the story, sometimes when you say telling a good story, it's not just one story. Sometimes it's the story of a whole season, or it's the story of a career. I mean, I don't know how many long form stories I wrote about Yogi Ferrell during his IU career. It was probably at least 5 or 6, but it was always fascinating to me to kind of revisit those stories and kind of look at, because I don't cover recruiting as much as I used to, but in some of my previous jobs, I covered not just sort of IU sports, but also IU recruiting very heavily. So I can go back to Yogi Ferrell's sophomore year of high school, and you can look at just the development of the ebbs and flows of an entire career. It's just fascinating to me to be able to tell those stories, and you hope people get something out of them, and not everybody will, and some people will probably relate more closely to some people's stories than others, and that's fine. But what I enjoy is just being able to tell a good story, and hopefully, make because I'm not like a fan of IU. Certainly, I wouldn't be able to do my job if I was. But hopefully, the people who are reading my stories, they're getting. I'm assuming a lot of them are reading them because they're IU fans. Hopefully, it's somehow enhancing kind of the enjoyment of the whole experience for them as well. Because again, if I'm writing thousands and thousands of words into a void and nobody's reading them, then what am I doing it for?
Absolutely. We've been listening to some excellent advice from Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star on behalf of Sports Talk with Tonsoni and Delphi Bracketology, Delphi High School, Community High School. We thank you, Zach, for coming on and sharing with our up-and-coming possibly journalists, but just better writers and better students. You made us better today. Thank you.
No, thanks for having me. Happy to do it.
And that'll do it for this issue of Sports Talk with Tonsoni.